Thank you, Admiral Pat. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 2016 State of the Coast Guard Address presented by Admiral Paul Zumkampf, our 25th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. Thank you for joining us today at this important event. My name is Ellen Engelman Connors. I have the privilege of serving as a member of the Senior Executive Service with the Coast Guard and also serve as the Acting Director of Governmental and Public Affairs. Today, I'll be your MC for this important event. Now, you all know the drill. If you have a cell phone, I ask that you please silence it now for the duration of the address. The State of the Coast Guard Address is an annual event that dates back to 1975. Today, we have the privilege of hosting you at the U.S. Capitol in this beautiful auditorium. I'd like to thank the Coast Guard Band and the Brass Quintet for playing this afternoon. It's under the leadership of Senior Chief Musician Richard Denton for their performance. We also have several distinguished guests here today. Representative Garrett Graves, the Honorable Pierre Clive Agius from the Embassy of Malta, the Honorable Francisco Campbell from the Embassy of Nicaragua, Director Michael Botticelli from the Office of National Drug and Control Policy, the Honorable Victor Mendez, Department of Transportation, the Honorable John Barnum, Department of Transportation, Admiral Bob Papp, 24th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, the Honorable Phyllis Schneck, Department of Homeland Security, Chief Master Sergeant John Troxell, Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman, Director Brian Salerno, Bureau of Safety and Environment Enforcement, Deputy Commissioner Kevin McAleenan, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Deputy Director Daniel Ragsdale, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Mrs. Fran Danino Zumkampf, Coast Guard Ombudsman at Large, Mrs. Janet Cantrell, Coast Guard Ombudsman at Large. A special thank you is extended to the Navy League of the United States for supporting this event. And finally, a very warm welcome is extended to congressional staffers, military attaché officers, senior government officials, local community partners, industry representatives, Coast Guard retirees, leadership, and the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard present with us today. Master Chief Stephen Cantrell, the 12th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, will now introduce our Commandant. Please join me in welcoming Master Chief Cantrell.
Good afternoon. Try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. There we go. I'm the warm-up act. But thank you all for being here today. It really is an honor to be here with you today in this great location as we hear the 2016 State of the Coast Guard Address. You know, in my job as the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, one of my favorite things in the world to do is get to travel around. And I travel around the globe and I meet with the men and women of our great Coast Guard. And I do a couple of things. I thank them for their service. But also, it's interesting to find out from them what it is that I can do to make their time in the service more fulfilling. And also, at times, I travel with my lovely wife, Janet, as we go around. We also get to meet and interact with families, which include spouses, ombudsmen, child care providers, those people that provide the service and support for our Coast Guard men and women. So I want to say a special thank you to those families for their service to our country, but more importantly, for their support and for their many sacrifices. Now, I've said this before, and I say it again, and it never gets old. I am always impressed with the world-class talent that represent our Coast Guard workforce. Continually impressed, but it never surprises me, because the Coast Guard continues to attract and retain the very best that the American public has to provide. Folks like YN3 Amanda Dietzen from Base Boston, who recently distinguished herself in a joint service training environment when she was selected and attended the Air Force's Airman Leadership School up at Hanscom Air Force Base. Not only did she attend this course and represent our Coast Guard very well, she walked away with the Top Graduate Award, which is something that's voted on by Air Force instructors and her fellow Air Force classmates. Our AST-3 Billy Arison from Air Station Atlantic City, who last October, during a regular flight around the Atlantic City area, was lowered into the water when a jet skier was capsized due to some heavy seas. Now, Billy was lowered into the water around these jagged edges around a jetty. He hooked onto the guy quickly, and as they spun dizzily over these crashing waves, you know, he never let go of this guy until he was safely delivered ashore. That's just two. That's two of probably 100 that I could come up with if we had the time today, but we'd frankly be here the rest of the afternoon. I want to talk about 2015 because it was a very prolific year for our Coast Guard and all aspects of our commitment to our workforce. We're leaning toward the future and continuing to invest in our great workforce. Some examples of that commitment: we've reinstated tuition assistance to 100%. We've made it a requirement for all new Chief Petty Officers to attend the Chief Petty Officers Academy. Similarly, we will now require all senior chiefs advancing to Master Chief to attend our Senior Enlisted Leader course. And we've mandated the Coast Guard's Apprentice Leadership Program and our A schools to give our junior petty officers the tools they need to be successful leaders. Additionally, we're working on a curriculum to educate our members on smart investing as we move into an era where we have a new retirement system, so that they have the resources and the knowledge they need to have a successful financial future, whether they serve for one tour or an entire career. And finally, most of you already know, just recently our Commandant authorized an extension to maternity leave for our female members that now goes to 12 weeks. It's these types of personnel policies that help the Coast Guard to be the service of choice for those great Americans who want to serve their nation. Along with our strong culture of honor, respect, and devotion to duty, we've assured to remain semper paratus for today's challenges and tomorrow's. Now, I wanted to close by recognizing a couple people in the crowd with us today. We've got so many people in this room that are powerful and influential of today's Coast Guard. But there's a lot of folks in this room, too, that are going to carry the Coast Guard into the future. So I want to introduce to you Seaman Apprentice Cameron Elliott and IT3 Anastasia Kemp. If you guys stand up for a second. You guys stay standing just for a minute, because I told you I was going to embarrass you a little bit. Now, Petty Officer Kemp is originally from Missouri, but grew up mostly on Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. She graduated IT school in December and is currently assigned to TISCOM over in Alexandria. She's been in the Coast Guard for 2.5 years, but she's got a master's degree in criminal justice and criminology and plans on pursuing her second master's degree in forensic science or education. And if that's not enough, folks, she's a published author of young adult novels. Now, our newest Coast Guard member, the Seaman Apprentice Elliott. He's from Columbia, North Carolina. He got out of boot camp about 2 weeks ago. And he's aboard the Coast Guard Cutter James Rankin up in Baltimore, but he brings to us a desire to serve in this Coast Guard, along with some experience as a civilian firefighter, wants to get his degree in criminal justice. So this, ladies and gentlemen, to me, represents the future of our Coast Guard. And I think if you get a chance later after the event to talk with him, I think you'll find that our future is in very good hands. So if you could join me for one more round of applause for these great Americans. So I continue to be humbled by things like this. Every day when I come to work, when I get to represent the men and women of our great Coast Guard, that's active duty, reserve, civilian, retirees, auxiliarists. And I truly, truly appreciate the opportunities that I get. And I'm thankful to be here with you all today. Thank you for all that you do for our United States Coast Guard. And the reason we're all here, I'm going to introduce my boss and welcome him to the podium, the 25th Commandant of your United States Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zukunft.
You should be applauding because I cut 1,000 words out of this year's State of the Coast Guard address. But I can't just say good afternoon. I should say it's a great afternoon because first we're blessed with Coast Guard weather, foul weather outside, which causes any member of the Coast Guard to be optimistic of fairer weather ahead. But also, we're blessed with the members in this audience today, members of Congress and their staff, members of the diplomatic corps, leaders in industry, leaders in the public sector, in our retired and active duty senior leaders. But more importantly, today, leveraging technology, this message reaches out to over 450 units in the Coast Guard through live streaming. We checked it, I got a tweet, and trust me, it works. But what a fitting venue for this year's State of the Coast Guard address. And let me tell you why. In the past, you have heard the Coast Guard compared to a dull knife, and our service being fraught with uncertain and stormy seas, and I'll come back to that. Well, this year's State of the Coast Guard address will be different, which is why I chose the Congressional Auditorium to deliver my address as we enter our 226th year of service. Now, on behalf of the 88,000 women of men of the Coast Guard, I profoundly thank the 114th Congress and this administration for delivering an authorization bill along with the largest acquisition budget in Coast Guard history. So what does this mean? This will allow us to shore up our aging infrastructure and invest in our capital fleet, and most importantly, our offshore patrol cutter. The largest and most critical acquisition in Coast Guard history, dating back to our fledgling fleet of 10 revenue cutters back in 1790. And there's more. The President's budget for 2017 paves the way to recapitalize our nation's diminishing fleet of heavy icebreakers. So today, in metaphoric terms, the barometer is rising, the storms have abated, and that dull knife is being honed to a fine edge as the Coast Guard is carving a true and straight course into the 21st century. Yes, the State of the Coast Guard remains Semper Paratus, always ready to guard the homeland, protect our environment, facilitate maritime commerce, save those in peril on the sea, and attack transnational criminal organizations who attempt to exploit the maritime domain. Now, our strategies that I announced last year, Arctic, Western Hemisphere, cyber, and energy, are just as relevant today, and as reflected in our recent appropriation, strategy is driving budget like never before. By leveraging the intelligence community, we are able to attack maritime threats with greater precision and balance risks across all of our mission areas to surge our limited resources where they are needed most. Let me give you a few examples. Our southwest border continually is besieged by unaccompanied minors fleeing the tri-border region of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. This phenomenon is directly related to the violent crime that plagues this region, and that violent crime is directly attributed to the maritime flow of cocaine that has landed in Central America, but ultimately destined for the United States for consumption here in the homeland. So by surging Coast Guard cutters and aircraft and leveraging the intelligence community, we seized or disrupted over 190 metric tons of cocaine and detained over 700 smugglers for prosecution in 2015. I was aboard Coast Guard cutter Stratton when they offloaded 32 metric tons of cocaine in San Diego. Not to be outdone, her sister ship Berthoff, who is deployed today as I speak, interdicted 22 metric tons of cocaine to include an 8 metric ton seizure from a self-propelled semi-submersible, the largest such seizure from such a vessel. Yes, our Western Hemisphere strategy is bearing fruit to the point where our national security cutters are more than justifying and paying for their initial acquisition cost and the value of cocaine removed in one deployment. But make no mistake, our strategy is not about bales of cocaine, but it's about promoting regional stability in Central America that is being eroded by transnational criminal organizations. And when I met recently with the president of Honduras, he was proud to say that violent crime in that country has decreased by 23%. And when I asked, to what does he attribute this reduction to? He says, quite simply, fewer drugs are coming ashore. That's right. We are turning the tide in this fight, and we are establishing rule of law and stability in our hemisphere to prevent this poison from coming ashore in Central America and eroding those communities. So to be clear, the problem of drug violence and drug abuse stretches to the American front door as well. It's tragic to say that drug deaths in the United States continue to rise, and nearly 50,000 Americans died last year of drug-related causes, more than died due to highway fatalities. So it is our unique Coast Guard authorities and our competencies that fuel this national strategy, which is why the largest naval presence in the Eastern Pacific and in the Caribbean has racing stripes and U.S. Coast Guard emblazoned on their hulls. And as we look further north to the high latitudes, it was our only medium icebreaker, Coast Guard Cutter Healy, that led a scientific mission to the North Pole this past summer. She was the first United States surface ship to independently accomplish this feat. Concurrently, one of our national security cutters, Weishi, deployed to the Arctic during the ice-free season, monitoring the offshore drilling activity in the Chukchi Sea, while also providing maritime domain awareness of an Arctic exercise among the combined navies of China and Russia. Strategic in the true sense. And I recently hosted the Arctic Coast Guard Forum in New London, and for the first time, we signed a formal general agreement that establishes this important body that includes every Arctic Council nation, including Russia. And I am committed, as is our 24th Commandant, to the safety, security, and environmental stewardship of the Arctic. And I will continue to lead this effort at the international level. Collectively, we are ensuring that shared responsibilities for mass search and rescue, pollution response, and safe navigation remain paramount among the Arctic Council nations. Meanwhile, Polar Star is heading north, having completed her third consecutive Operation Deep Freeze in Antarctica. She flies the flag of our nation's sole operational heavy icebreaker, capable of operating in ice up to 21 feet thick. Now, it causes me great discomfort, as it should everybody in this audience and those who are following us on live stream. And the reason is the United States has no insurance policy, no self-rescue capability whatsoever should Polar Star and her nearly 40-year-old engineering plant suffer a casualty and become beset in ice in Antarctica. I can't be more grateful for our President's ardent support and his call for heavy icebreakers to ensure the United States maintains year-round access to the strategic polar regions. Importantly, the President's budget includes funding to accelerate acquisition of new heavy icebreakers. And with the support of Congress, I am moving out to recapitalize our nation's heavy icebreaking capability. And so around the world, we are recognized as the world's premier Coast Guard. And our international partners routinely invest in us to gain expertise, and insight into our unique capabilities and authorities. So today, we have 22 members of the Coast Guard serving in Saudi Arabia, as the Kingdom of Saud generates a maritime border guard in the image of the United States Coast Guard. Also, we have 36 senior enlisted members currently residing in the United Kingdom along with their dependents and serving on full-time 3-year tours in Her Majesty's Navy. And you may ask, what? Well, a number of years ago, the Royal Navy curtailed its accessions due to fiscal constraints, something we're not familiar with. And this gap a number of years ago has manifested itself today in a shortage of senior enlisted technicians and, more importantly, leaders in Her Majesty's Navy today. Now, for members of Congress, this is fully reimbursed, and it didn't cost the Coast Guard or taxpayers one dime. But what this does go to prove is you cannot surge expertise, you can't surge leadership, you have to grow it from the bottom up. And as I look elsewhere today, our all-reserve Port Security Unit 313 out of Seattle is standing the watch, securing the maritime approaches to the detention facility in Guantanamo, as we have for nearly a decade. And in the Middle East, our squadron of 6 patrol boats continue to police the waters of the northern Arabian Gulf and fend off provocations by the Iranian Guard, Republican Guard Navy. Now, going back in time, the father of the Coast Guard, Alexander Hamilton, in his charge to the first captains of the Revenue Marine, our Coast Guard forebears, stated, "Be mindful that we are a country of free men, impatient of rude and haughty behavior." We call this a principle of restraint, and ever mindful of Hamilton's principle of restraint, this past year, our helicopter interdiction squadron crews employed aviation use of force successfully on 49 separate occasions, surpassing the record of 46 interdictions the previous year. Now, these interdictions often occur at night against evasive go-fasts, and time and again, our crews deliver precision disabling fire into the multiple outboard engines of these drug-laden vessels without causing undue injury to the traffickers. And this summer, a group of kayaktivists took to the shipping lanes in Puget Sound to block the movement of a fleet of support vessels destined for offshore drilling in the Arctic. And it was our sector personnel who met with the protesters and assured their First Amendment rights to assemble, in so much as it did not impede safe navigation. Now, when a breach of safe navigation occurred, it was Coast Guard command presence and patience that ruled the day. Now, I share this story of restraint because it de-escalized a very tense situation in such a way that it never became a national story, which was the national story at that time with the scrutiny that law enforcement was coming under. And as I look across this room, but more importantly, to our 450 units who are standing the watch, the reason why we serve in Washington, D.C. today, I could not be more proud of our United States Coast Guard. So back to Alexander Hamilton. He had another attribute that we have embraced today, and we call it service before self. It's one of my guiding principles that you can see behind me. And it was Bernie Weber who epitomized this attribute. During his heroic rescue of 32 mariners from the SS Pendleton, showcased in Disney's pictures, The Finest Hours, he stated, "We all live or we'll all die." Now, there's more to this story. If you read the book by Casey Sherman and Mike Tugayas, Bernie Weber was going to be recognized with the Gold Life-Saving Medal following this heroic rescue. But his 3 crew members, Andy Fitzgerald, Richard Livesey, and Irvin Maskey, were excluded from this formal recognition. And Bernie Weber said, "We either all get recognized or no one gets recognized." And that is service before self. Bernie Weber was 24 years old at the time, about the same age as Petty Officer Kemp that we saw here today. So if we look at our legacy and the future of the Coast Guard, who can't help be optimistic? But I will say, if you've seen the movie or read the book, bear in mind there is no Coast Guard regulation that says you have to go out, but you don't have to come back in. I expect all of our Coast Guard crews to make it back in and make it back safely. And when I think further about service before self, my first thought is our Coast Guard Auxiliary, our nearly 30,000 strong, all volunteer patriots who wear a uniform very similar to mine and safeguard our waters and the more than 74 million boaters who ply those waters. This past year, it was our Coast Guard Auxiliary who contributed more than 4 million man-hours in support of Coast Guard missions, and most importantly, they saved 166 lives, all volunteers. You would be hard-pressed to find a more professional and committed group of maritime guardians anywhere on the face of the globe. So please join me in a round of applause for our Coast Guard Auxiliary. As you've heard since my last State of the Coast Guard address, your Coast Guard is about earning public trust. Now, we've done that with our 3rd consecutive clean financial audit opinion and the only military service to attain one, but we scored a hat trick. We're also about mission accomplishment, intelligence-driving operations, and strategy-driving budget, and now we have a budget that strikes the words, doing more with less or doing everything with nothing, from our lexicon. So you might say, after all of these accomplishments, what next? So let me tell you, it's in the middle of my commandant's direction. And it comes down to 3 words: duty to people. Yes, I'm overjoyed with our recent budgets and the great strides we are making with the support of this Congress and administration to recapitalize the Coast Guard. Our air, afloat, and ashore capital plants are coming out of remission. They are being replaced with much more capable and complex platforms, while our world of work in prevention, response, support, intelligence, and cyber continue to expand. So for all the investments we are making in our capital plant, if they are not matched with a commensurate investment in our people, those aircraft, cutters, rescue boats, and skill sets required to operate them will indeed become hollow. In the past, the Coast Guard could be compared to that line out of the movie, Field of Dreams: if you build it, they will come. And as I look around this room today and out to our field units, what a dream team that we have assembled, with some of the absolute best talent in our nation taking the oath to serve in the United States Coast Guard. And it's no different in our civilian workforce, who arrive as subject matter experts. Today, the American workforce is changing. Each day, hundreds of military and civilian personnel leave federal service, and notably, the largest concentration in our service among our civil servants are 54 years of age and nearing retirement. On the recruiting front, fewer than 25% of people between the ages of 17 and 24 meet the minimal requirements for military service. So this takes me back to the lessons learned by the Royal Navy. You can't surge experience and leadership. You have to grow it from the bottom up. And let there be no doubt that this 25% that we are competing for is also being competed against the private sector, from airlines to cruise ships to the high-tech industry. And not just that 25%, but they're also looking at those in uniform serving today. And last month, I visited Silicon Valley. I paid a visit to the HR executives at Facebook, Tesla, LinkedIn, Google, and a number of others, and I left with a few critical takeaways. There were three. First, they are seeking competitive talent, just like we are, and they have fantastic brand recognition. Second, the private sector recognizes that retaining top talent goes far beyond benefits and compensation. Organizational trust is a new form of currency. And third, people care a lot about mission. I met with employees at the high-tech companies, and to a person they said, "We are here to change the world. That's our mission." So how are we managing talent in the 21st century workforce for the Coast Guard? Fortunately, the Coast Guard has a fantastic brand and a deeply imbued sense of mission that permeates everything that we do. We must never lose sight of that. Rather, we must ensure that everyone willing and qualified to join us is provided with the training, resources, and opportunities to maximize their ability to serve. And I call upon our leaders at all levels of our organization to energetically embrace and cultivate this environment. In 2018 and beyond, all military services will be shifting to a blended retirement plan. Military members will be entitled to contribute 5% of their pay with a matching government contribution, and then take that with them after just a few years of service. This provides a much greater level of flexibility than the military has offered dating back to World War II. It's a great incentive for our future workforce. However, I am equally mindful that it may open doors for members to depart well before the traditional 20-year mark. And not insignificantly, I have to figure out how I'm going to match that 5% out of our operating expense account. On another note, our commitment to diversity is a good news story. Our inclusiveness is reaping huge rewards, and today, at our Coast Guard Academy, it is more diverse than it has ever been in its 150-year history. The classes of 2018 and 2019 are comprised of nearly 40% women and 33% underrepresented minorities. And I am sure most Academy graduates who are out there today will feel much like I do, because this corps of cadets are critical thinkers. They're gifted athletes and artists. They're military professionals. And I'm glad I applied when I did, because I would be on the outside of Chase Hall looking in at the Corps cadets assembled on the parade field. If you can't be more optimistic about the future leadership of the Coast Guard, spend a few hours at the Coast Guard Academy or our training center at Cape May, and you will walk away refreshed. But our work is far from done when it comes to diversity and inclusiveness. And when I look at a given year group, after 10 years of service, half of our women and half of our minority members have departed the Coast Guard. Now, we must tackle retention. So what's a commandant to do? Well, we have a strategy for the Arctic, Western Hemisphere, cyber, energy, and a 5-year strategic intent, all promulgated within the last 2 years. And now, we finally have a strategy for our people. That's right, a human capital strategy that will have a myriad of action items, some of those you heard from Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, Steve Cantrell, that provide a framework for talent management and recruiting, training, and retaining the absolute best active, reserve, civilian, and auxiliary workforce in the world. We reach back to a number of our retired flag officers who helped in crafting this strategy. And it will be Rear Admiral Bill Kelly who will be my trail boss in its implementation. See you hiding under your seat over there, Bill. Who, like me, we are both extremely passionate New York Mets fans. But that passion absolutely pales in comparison to our passion for our people, all 88,000 active, reserve, civil servant, and auxiliary members of the Coast Guard. And if you look in the eyes of our people, you will find this passion of service before self and duty to people at each and every Coast Guard unit. Just over a week ago, I placed a phone call with Storekeeper Second Class Jennifer Smith. The rest of this story goes as such. She was vacationing in Belize this past year. She was assaulted, robbed at knife point, suffering near mortal stab wounds to her spinal column and the back of her head. She and her husband had just purchased a fixer-upper in Michigan, a home that Jennifer will never return to because of her injuries that have also caused some financial challenges to accompany her physical pain. And this is where duty to people kicks in. Our chief petty officers and members of her unit at Coast Guard Air Station Detroit contributed more than $10,000 in materials, but more importantly, over thousands of man-hours to turn this fixer-upper into a model home suited for better homes and gardens. That is duty to people. But there's another aspect of duty to people. And a fundamental aspect of duty to people is trust. The one breach of trust that bothers me most is sexual assault in our Coast Guard. We are moving in the right direction to educate the workforce and respond to each and every allegation of sexual assault. And we've seen a decreasing number of unrestricted reports that indicate perhaps fewer assaults, but I can't take this measure to cause me to lose laser focus on sexual assault in the Coast Guard, and we will remain laser focused. Let me be clear, no one joins the Coast Guard, male or female, with the expectation to be a victim of sexual assault, especially by a shipmate. That is a breach of trust that absolutely must be driven from the Coast Guard for eternity. And to all 88,000 members of the Coast Guard, we will continue to say, not in my Coast Guard. I also look to our civilian workforce, not in the context of sexual assault, but our civilian workforce is a very positively motivated, and it's a highly committed component of the Coast Guard. And I say this because our employee viewpoint survey bears this out. But there's still work to be done, specifically providing better upward mobility for our civil servants. And I need to reduce the time required for a civil servant to join the Coast Guard. I cannot be the employer of choice when it takes 145 days for a new civil servant to join the Coast Guard team. As I look out, one of our civilians among many, but I want to call attention to Andrew Dove. Andrew, if you want to stand up for just a second. No, please. I didn't recognize Andrew without the hard hat, but Andrew is a civilian technician. He works at our Coast Guard yard in Curtis Bay. He is the equivalent of all NASA employees back in the 1960s who, when asked what they do to a person would respond, "We are going to put the first man on the moon." Well, that's been accomplished. But in Andrew's case, he can be found working in and around our 50-year-old cutters in spaces that, quite frankly, require a human contortionist. He can proudly say that he is safely, and I emphasize safely, putting men and women to sea, attacking traffickers, saving lives, protecting the environment, and securing our homeland. Yes, he is a pivotal part of the mission support network that stands strong behind every Coast Guard operation. Andrew, and to all of our civil servants, thank you for all that you do for our Coast Guard. Thank you. And there's more. We owe it to our all-volunteer Coast Guard Auxiliary. Case in point, we need to eliminate the backlog of background checks that has been constricting the ability of our auxiliary to recruit and retain new members. Now, last year, 1,500 potential auxiliarists were awaiting background checks before they can join an all-volunteer service. This year, it's over 2,500. I have directed the development of a plan that will provide short-term relief and a long-term solution to auxiliary background checks. I will fix it, period. And as I take inventory of our Coast Guard, including all 41,000 active duty, 7,000 reserve, 8,500 civilian servants, and nearly 30,000 auxiliary, we are very well equipped, but undermanned to be semper paratus in a world that is anything but tranquil or secure from man-made and natural disasters. Looking back, we are fortunate that events like Katrina, Deepwater Horizon, and Sandy were not compounded with a mass migration, terrorist attack, or a complex catastrophe like a Cascadia subduction zone event in the Pacific Northwest. If you're not familiar with it, Google it. Worse than the San Andreas Fault. And yes, sea levels are rising at a point where more and more of our growing population are migrating to the coast, and the wealth that is concentrated there as well. And so we must be semper paratus when the next major events occur, as the American public fully expects. Which is why our human capital strategy and retaining our most vital asset, our people, is the bedrock of this State of the Coast Guard address. It's all about people. And most people, forgive me for all the movie metaphors, and some of you were probably, unless you were born in the 70s or earlier, are not familiar with the great American cinema classic, the movie Jaws. And so in it, Police Chief Brody, when he first lays eyes on that 30-foot great white shark attacking New England beachgoers, says to his colleague, Captain Quinn, "You're going to need a bigger boat." Now, that's a great expression that lives on to state the obvious. Well, let me nuance that just a bit. Looking at the challenges we're facing in the world today, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to need a bigger Coast Guard. A part of my commitment under duty to people is ensuring we have an appropriately sized and trained force. As required by our 2015 Authorization Act, I am requiring a Coast Guard manpower requirements plan to formally establish a force size informed by strategy, analysis, and risk management. And as we move forward, duty to people will take shape in a number of ways across our organization. You're going to see mission, service, and individual level changes to best align our talent with the demands of the 21st century. And it works like this. At the mission level, we will employ a cyber task force that will take our cyber strategy and turn it into an operational arm of the Coast Guard. Not a new mission, but a skill set that cuts across every mission area of the Coast Guard. By necessity, we will be a more specialized Coast Guard across our prevention, response, support, intelligence, and cyber communities. At the service level, you're already seeing assignment policy changes to improve geographic stability, expanded maternity leave, rebalanced CPay, and a continued emphasis on our sexual assault prevention and response campaign. And at the individual level, we are already overhauling tuition assistance to the betterment of our workforce. We're institutionalizing a continuum of leadership development among our enlisted officer and civilian workforce, and we are providing occupational credentialing for our service members that translate to education and qualification equivalencies in the private sector. Now, this list is far from all-inclusive, and to our men and women of the Coast Guard, I will keep you apprised as we continue to seek your input as we add flesh and bone to our human capital strategy. Now, let me close by saying that I could not be more optimistic about today's state of the Coast Guard. Our strategy is driving our largest acquisition budget ever. Intelligence is driving record-breaking operations, and our Coast Guard people are the heartbeat behind it all. As I travel, I meet new members at our recruiting station at Cape May with advanced degrees. We have civil servants like Andrew, providing technical assistance and specialized knowledge in every mission area. We have volunteer auxiliaries, bringing over 160 job skills to our workforce, and we have a Coast Guard Reserve comprised of corporate executives, first responders, and all walks of professional life, bringing broad talent and tremendous surge capacity to the Coast Guard each and every day. And let us not forget, we have our Coast Guard families, those who do not take an oath to join this service, but they support us and they serve alongside us each and every day. We owe it to our Coast Guard families to give them a well-deserved round of applause. It's not part of our oath, but it should be in our Coast Guard that you should also be an optimist. And so throughout my nearly 39-year career in the Coast Guard, I've always been an optimist. I've always placed my trust in our senior leadership to plot the right course for the Coast Guard. And those leaders got it right when you look how the Coast Guard has evolved over time. Now, when we use the term dull knife with our 21st Commandant, uncertain and stormy seas with our 24th Commandant, those were aptly chosen words that described the challenges that we faced in that period of time. But it was their steadfast hand that enabled the Coast Guard to evolve where it is today. And trust me, more challenges will lurk upon the horizon. And when I look at the extensive talent that we have in our workforce, I could not be more optimistic that we will stand up to those challenges and the Coast Guard will emerge even stronger than when we encountered those uncertain and stormy seas. So let me assure you, today's track line steers us straight of any rocks and shoals. And true to BM1 Bernie Weber's heroics, these are truly the finest hours to serve in the United States Coast Guard. God bless you all, and Semper Paratus. Thank you for being here today.